They tried to fine him for casting a line. But the HOA never expected the twist. He bought the river itself and banned them forever. The river had always been my place of peace. Early evenings were the best time to sit along the bank, the air cool and crisp, the water glistening under streaks of fading sunlight. I had been fishing since I was a boy, and there was something grounding about it. The patience, the silence, the way the current carried all worries downstream. My line sat steady, bobbing gently in the water, when suddenly the screech of tires cut through the calm like a blade. I turned my head, frowning as gravel scattered across the narrow road behind me. A black SUV swerved in hard, parking crookedly just a few feet from where the grass ended. The door flew open, and out stepped Richard, the self-proclaimed king of the neighborhood. He adjusted his pressed shirt, his chest puffed out as if he were about to deliver a speech, and in his hand he carried a bright yellow citation slip, waving it like it was some kind of royal decree. "There you are," Richard announced, his voice loud enough for the nearby walkers and joggers to hear. He held the paper between two fingers and shoved it toward me with a smirk. "You've been fined for unauthorized fishing on HOA-controlled property." For a moment, I just stared at him. His arrogance was a performance, and the board members who trailed after him, 3 men with clipboards, watched like loyal followers, nodding as if Richard's words were gospel. I set my fishing pole carefully on the grass beside me, stood up slowly, and met his gaze. "This river," I said calmly, my voice steady, "isn't HOA property. It's public water. You know that." Richard's smirk widened, his eyes glinting like he'd been waiting for this response. "That's where you're wrong," he replied, shaking the paper as if it proved his point. "The board voted last month. Fishing here is now prohibited without HOA approval. You've been warned before. Now you're being fined." The words carried, and I could feel the weight of neighbors' stares from across the street. Some stopped their evening strolls to watch, whispering to one another. The board members scribbled on their clipboards, writing notes like investigators building a case. Richard thrived on the attention he always had. He wasn't just giving me a citation. He was staging a public humiliation. I took the paper from his hand, unfolded it, and read the absurd charge. Hundreds of dollars for illegal fishing. My jaw tightened, but I didn't raise my voice. I could feel a fire building in my chest, but I kept my face unreadable. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice enough so that only I could hear. "You think you're above the rules, don't you? You think you can do whatever you want. But not here. Not while I'm in charge." His breath carried the faint smell of coffee, and his words dripped with satisfaction. To him, this was victory. He believed he had cornered me. "Richard," I said, folding the paper neatly and slipping into my pocket, "you just made a big mistake." He straightened, letting out a short laugh, and turned to the men behind him. "See? He still thinks he's untouchable. That's the problem with people like him. They think the rules don't apply." One of the board members, Thomas, gave a nervous chuckle, but I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wasn't as confident as Richard, though he wouldn't dare oppose him here. Not yet. Richard raised his voice again for the audience gathering along the sidewalk. "Let this be an example. Rule breakers don't get to hide. This neighborhood has standards, and I will enforce them." The whispers grew louder among the bystanders. Some nodded, agreeing. Others frowned, shifting uncomfortably. But nobody spoke up. That was how Richard operated. Through fear, through showmanship, through the illusion that he held absolute power. I bent down and picked up my fishing pole. Slowly, deliberately, I reeled in the line, the quiet click of the reel cutting through the heavy silence. Richard expected me to argue, to protest, maybe even to beg. Instead, I stayed calm. That silence unsettled him. "You hear me?" Richard barked, his confidence wavering just slightly. "You're done here. Fishing privileges revoked. Next time it'll be worse." I glanced at him, my expression unreadable, then shouldered my pole and stepped past him without a word. My silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every man there would remember the calm way I walked away while Richard shouted. Behind me, I heard him muttering, his voice rising again for the crowd. "Go on then. Walk away. but you'll pay every cent. Every cent. The SUV door slammed, the sound echoing through the riverbank as he left. The board members scattered, their clipboards hugging their chests like shields. The crowd slowly dispersed, but I caught glimpses of faces, curiosity, confusion, and maybe, just maybe, sympathy. As I walked home, the folded citation heavy in my pocket, my thoughts burned. This wasn't about fishing. This was about control. Richard had chosen me as his example, but he didn't realize I had already begun noticing his mistakes. Little cracks in his empire, whispers of questionable spending, and fines that didn't match up with bylaws. He was so busy playing the tyrant that he hadn't noticed someone watching, someone patient enough to strike at the right moment. At home, I laid the citation flat on the kitchen table and studied it. The language was sloppy, the signature rushed. It wasn't just arrogance, it was carelessness. Carelessness always left a trail. I thought back to his words, the smug confidence in his voice. Not while I'm in charge. I smiled faintly to myself, the same way I had at the riverbank. Richard had no idea that in his hunger for power, he just handed me the first piece of evidence I needed. The river outside flowed steady, quiet, relentless. Just like me. The morning after Richard shoved that bogus citation into my hand, I walked outside to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Lawns glistened with dew, sprinklers hissed rhythmically, and for a brief second it almost felt like the kind of peaceful community the brochures once promised. But peace never lasted long under Richard's rule. Across the street, a man in gym clothes cursed under his breath as he peeled a fresh orange slip from his mailbox. I could see the frustration in his clenched jaw. Another fine. 2 houses down, a pickup truck idled while its owner dragged his garbage bins back in a hurry, muttering about how they had only been out 5 minutes too long. Richard's SUV made slow rounds through the streets every morning like a predator on patrol, windows down, clipboard in hand, scanning for the smallest violation. Richard didn't just enforce the rules. He created them out of thin air. No trucks parked overnight, even in private driveways. No curtains visible from the street, unless they were white or beige. Grass could not exceed 3 inches, not even by half. It was tyranny disguised as community standards, and he thrived on it to be by the time the neighborhood realized what was happening. Richard had already filled the HOA board with his allies. Men like Thomas and Gregory, neighbors who once grumbled about his strictness, suddenly became his enforcers after a few favors, whispered promises, and, in some cases, fear of being fined themselves. They sat at his side during meetings, nodding at every word, and voted unanimously on every new restriction. Watching them was like watching soldiers obey a general. I learned quickly that Richard's fines weren't random. They were strategic. He fined the weak in his silence, pressured the stubborn into compliance, and rewarded the obedient with leniency. Control was his real currency, and he spent it lavishly. It didn't take long for him to single me out. My fishing that afternoon wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening move in a campaign. 2 days later, as I trimmed my hedges, Richard strolled up the sidewalk with Gregory trailing behind him. His steps were slow, measured like a man inspecting his kingdom. "Afternoon," he said, flashing that familiar smug smile. He held a clipboard against his chest, pen tapping in rhythm. "Lovely hedges. Shame if they were out of code." I paused mid-trim, my eyes narrowing. "They're fine, Richard. Measured this morning. Under 3 feet. He leaned closer, pretending to study them, then scribbled something onto his clipboard anyway. I'll have to double-check." His voice dropped as he added, "You should learn to cooperate. Makes life easier." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked away with Gregory, chuckling as though he'd already won. That night, I found a warning notice taped to my front door. Hedges exceeding regulation height. Correct immediately or face fine. I stared at it for a long moment, then set it neatly on the table beside the fishing citation. 2 false charges in 1 week. It didn't stop there. Rumors began spreading through the neighborhood, subtle at first. At the corner store, a man I'd known for years asked cautiously, "Hey, I heard Richard say you've been fishing illegally. Something about stealing from the river." The way he said it told me he didn't believe it, but the fact that it reached his ears meant Richard was working overtime. By the weekend, another neighbor confronted me on the sidewalk. "Is it true you damaged the riverbank? That you're breaking county laws?" His eyes darted nervously, as if even asking me might earn him a fine. "No," I said firmly. "That's a lie." But I could feel Richard's strategy taking root. He was isolating me, painting me as reckless, lawless, someone who thought the rules didn't apply. It wasn't about fishing anymore. It was about character assassination. At the next HOA meeting, the pattern was unmistakable. The community center was packed, men lining the chairs, some leaning against walls, their arms crossed. Richard stood at the podium, shoulders back, chin lifted, as if he were delivering a sermon. "We must protect the integrity of this neighborhood," he declared, his voice echoing through the room. "One man's defiance cannot be allowed to spread. Rules exist for a reason." His eyes swept the crowd before landing squarely on me. He didn't say my name, but everyone knew who he meant. The board members flanked him, nodding in rehearsed agreement. A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded, others looked uncomfortable. No one spoke against him. That was Richard's gift. He had weaponized silence. He made men fear that speaking out would bring his spotlight onto them next. I sat calmly, hands folded, my expression unreadable. Let him perform. Let him dig his own hole. The meeting ended with another barrage of restrictions passed unanimously. No unapproved outdoor activities near community property. No fishing within HOA boundaries, despite the fact the river wasn't theirs to govern. I could almost hear the sound of shackles tightening on a neighborhood. But while Richard believed he was tightening control, I was quietly observing, cataloging every move, every overreach. His arrogance blinded him. He thought I was powerless, but what he didn't realize was that his obsession with me was exposing his hand. The real twist came late one evening when I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. I was walking past Gregory's house when his window, left slightly open, carried voices into the street. "He won't last long," Richard was saying. "We'll bury him in fines. If that doesn't work, we'll push for liens. Imagine losing your home over fishing. That'll send a message." Gregory chuckled nervously. "Are you sure we can do that legally?" Richard's voice hardened. "Legality is what I say it is. By the time anyone questions it, we'll have already won." I froze in the shadows, my fists tightening. He wasn't just targeting me. He was plotting to take my home. That was his real endgame. Fishing was just the excuse. I slipped away quietly, but inside me the fire grew hotter. Richard had just revealed his true nature. Not just power-hungry, but ruthless enough to weaponize the system against anyone who defied him. Back home, I sat in the dim glow of my desk lamp, staring at the two false citations laid side by side. They weren't just pieces of paper anymore. They were proof of a tyrant's arrogance, breadcrumbs leading to something bigger. Richard thrived on control, but control breeds carelessness. And carelessness always left evidence. As the river flowed steady outside my window, I promised myself one thing. Richard would come to regret making me his target. The evening air carried the faint smell of river water, cool and steady, the kind of air that usually cleared a man's mind after a long day. But as I walked down the dirt path with my fishing gear slung over my shoulder, I caught sight of something that froze me in my tracks. A metal sign glared back at me, freshly hammered into the ground. Its surface reflected the last streaks of sunlight, bold black letters shouting across the quiet riverside. HOA property. Fishing strictly prohibited. Beside the sign stood Richard, arms folded across his chest like a general surveying conquered ground. Two of his loyal board members flanked him, one scribbling notes on a clipboard, the other with his phone raised, recording the moment as if it were some grand victory. Richard's smirk was wide and deliberate, designed to cut through me. I didn't need anyone to explain what was happening. This wasn't about fishing. It wasn't about property lines. It was about humiliation. Richard wanted me to feel small, powerless, and cornered. I kept my steps steady, my eyes scanning the sign, then Richard, then the men at his side. My pulse quickened, but I forced my breathing to stay calm. He thrived on reactions, on watching others flinch. You like it? Richard finally spoke, his voice dripping with satisfaction. He tapped the sign with his knuckles, the metal ringing out in the quiet. New rule: no fishing on our river. I studied him for a long moment before answering. You don't own the river, Richard. My tone was calm, almost too calm, but my grip tightened on the handle of my tackle box. He chuckled, the sound smug and grating. The HOA has authority over this land, and that includes the riverbank. That means if you cast that line, you're trespassing. Before I could respond, one of the board members, the one with the clipboard, chimed in nervously. We've documented everything. The fines will be added immediately. Richard's eyes gleamed as he leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You thought paying a few fines would make me stop, but I'm not done. I'll bury you in paper, in liens, in court dates. You'll drown in it. The threat was clear, and for a moment, silence settled between us. The river gurgled softly nearby, indifferent to the battle being staged at its banks. Then Richard raised his phone and spoke louder, performing for his board members. Go ahead, cast that line, and we'll see how fast you end up in court. I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I'll let the tension drag out, my mind already racing ahead. Every step he took, every boast, every threat, he was digging himself deeper. But Richard wasn't finished. He wanted more. With exaggerated dramatics, he pulled out his phone and dialed. Sheriff's Department? Yes, I'd like to report trespassing on HOA property. Immediate response requested. He glanced at me with triumph, his grin widening. Let's see what the law has to say. Minutes later, the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a county deputy. The man stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt as his eyes flicked between me, Richard, and the freshly planted sign. What seems to be the problem? The deputy asked, his tone neutral but laced with caution. This man, Richard declared, pointing at me with theatrical confidence, is trespassing on HOA property. He's violating our regulations by fishing in this river. The deputy squinted, pulling out a small notepad. He looked at me. Do you have any paperwork showing who owns this stretch of riverbank? Wordlessly, I pulled a folded copy of the county's property map from my tackle box, something I had started carrying ever since Richard's harassment escalated. The deputy took it, examined it carefully, and then turned back to Richard. Sir, the deputy said firmly, the HOA does not own this river or its banks. You have no authority to post restrictions here. For the first time, the smirk faltered on Richard's face. His board members exchanged uneasy glances. But the HOA sets rules for this community. Richard stammered, his voice rising in desperation. On common property, the deputy corrected, folding the map neatly and returning it to me. This river isn't common property. If you continue to harass him, you may be the one facing charges. The deputy's warning hit harder than I expected. Richard's jaw worked furiously, but he forced a laugh, waving the moment away as if it were nothing. Of course. Just a misunderstanding. Yet when the deputy left, the smirk returned, colder this time, sharper, fueled by resentment. Enjoy your little victory, Richard muttered. It'll be your last. The very next day, envelopes appeared in my mailbox. New fines, double the amount of the previous ones. Threats of liens, talk of lawsuits. Richard was doubling down, too blinded by arrogance to recognize he had overstepped. But I didn't tear the letters apart in frustration. I laid them neatly on my kitchen table, side by side, like pieces of a puzzle. I photographed each one, recorded the dates, noted the contradictions. I even filmed a short clip of myself opening them, timestamp visible on the screen. If Richard thought intimidation would break me, he had underestimated how patient I could be. Then came his biggest mistake. Weeks later, I received a letter with a county seal embossed on the top. At first glance, it looked official, until I noticed the odd phrasing, the awkward grammar, the way the signature line didn't match any county official I knew. The letter demanded payment for river access rights through the HOA. It claimed the county required me to pay additional fees collected by Richard's board in order to legally fish. The moment I finished reading, a cold wave of realization washed over me. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was fraud. I held the paper up to the light, examining the seal. It was slightly off-center, poorly replicated. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the gravity of what Richard had just done. He had stepped out of the gray area of harassment and into the black and white world of crime. I set the letter down carefully, almost reverently. The air in my kitchen seemed heavier, thicker, charged with possibility. Richard believed he had me cornered, boxed in by rules and paperwork. But in his arrogance, he had handed me the very weapon that could dismantle everything he built. That night, I sat at my desk, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of my mouth as I organized my files, videos, photos, letters, recordings. Piece by piece, I was building a case not just strong enough to defend myself, but powerful enough to break Richard and every man standing behind him. He thought the river was his stage, the HOA his army, and the law his shield. But I had patience. I had proof. And I had just started laying the trap that would drown him in his own lies. The night Richard nailed his forged county letter to my front door, the moon hung low and heavy, casting silver streaks across the river. I held the fake notice in my hands, tracing every word he had typed with shaking fingers, not out of fear, but out of restrained fury. He had no idea that every paper he shoved in my face, every official threat he delivered, was fuel for the fire I was quietly building. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the rope I was letting him tighten around his own neck. For weeks, Richard strutted through the neighborhood like a king surveying conquered land. He didn't notice me at the county records office, sitting with clerks who eagerly handed me property maps, water rights deeds, and expired permits. He didn't notice the quiet meetings I had with two brothers who owned the unused acreage upstream. They were older men, tired of Richard's antics, tired of being told they couldn't even launch their own canoe without some HOA board member waving a clipboard in their faces. When I offered them a clean deal and full respect of their rights, they didn't hesitate. The paperwork took months, but I never rushed. Every time Richard tried to corner me with another fine, I filed it neatly into a growing binder. Every sheriff's visit, every false claim he made, every smug speech he gave at HOA meetings, it was all documented. I even managed to get a recording from one of his own board members, a nervous man who had grown tired of Richard's bullying. On that recording, Richard laughed and said, "I'll break him. He thinks the river is his. Watch me. I'll make him crawl." I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I just waited. The day the last document slid across the attorney's desk was the day the tides shifted. I had the deed in my hands, stamped and sealed. Not just to the riverbank where I fished, but the entire stretch of water that curved like a spine through the neighborhood. The water, the access paths, even the little dock at the park Richard loved to brag about during HOA picnics. All of it mine. I didn't tell anyone at first. I wanted Richard to keep digging. I wanted him to believe he was winning. That evening, as he patrolled the neighborhood with two board members at his side, he spotted me near the river, casting a line. His face turned crimson. "You've got guts, standing here after everything I've told you," Richard barked, his chest puffed out, the citation book already in his hand. I reeled in slowly, not even glancing at him until the line was taut. Then I turned, calm as ever. "Evening, Richard. This is the last straw," he snapped, scribbling something furiously. "You're trespassing on HOA property. You'll be fined, and this time you'll pay." His men chuckled, nodding like trained dogs. One of them muttered, "He's finished." That was my moment. I reached into my bag, not for a wallet, not for proof of payment, but for the deed itself. A thick envelope, crisp with freshly signed papers. I unfolded it carefully, holding it up so the street lamp caught the county seal. "This," I said, my voice steady, "isn't your property, Richard. It's mine." For the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. What are you talking about?" "I bought the river," I explained, each word deliberate. "Every inch of it. From the bank you're standing on to the dock you like to brag about at your barbecues." The landowners upstream were more than happy to sell. And the county? They signed off without hesitation. Silence spread like wildfire. Even the board members beside him stepped back, their eyes wide. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out cracked. You're bluffing. Am I? I asked, pulling out my phone. I tapped the screen, and up came a video, recorded earlier that day, of the county clerk congratulating me on the purchase, shaking my hand with the deed between us. The color drained from Richard's face. But I wasn't done. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a freshly painted sign. The metal gleamed under the lamplight as I drove it into the ground with one heavy strike of a mallet. The words shone clear and merciless. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Gasps echoed from a few men who had gathered nearby, curious about the confrontation. Richard's own supporters stood frozen, their loyalty cracking under the weight of reality. "You can't do this," Richard stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is the HOA's river. We've managed it for years." "You managed nothing," I cut in sharply. "You lied, you forged documents, and you threatened your neighbors. This river was never yours, and now it never will be." Richard lunged forward, ripping at the deed in my hand, but one of his own board members stopped him, muttering, "He's right, Richard. If he owns it, there's nothing we can do." The night ended with Richard storming off, red-faced and shouting empty threats into the dark. But the real shift came the next morning when neighbors awoke to find my new signs lined along the banks. Where Richard's bold, HOA property, no fishing signs had once stood, mine now towered larger, stronger, and backed by law. Men who had once laughed at Richard's jokes now stood at the river's edge, whispering in disbelief. By noon, Richard called an emergency meeting, demanding obedience, insisting I had stolen the river. But when he slammed his hand on the table, one of his own men spoke up. "No, Richard, you lost it, and you dragged us down with you." That was the day Richard's power began to fracture. His weapon of fear had been turned against him, and his board saw it with their own eyes. And I wasn't finished, because what Richard didn't yet realize was that the signs, the deed, even the public humiliation, that was just the opening act. The real blow was still coming, hidden in the files, recordings, and evidence I had tucked neatly away. And when I chose to unleash it, Richard wouldn't just lose his river. He'd lose everything. The night of the HOA meeting felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Every driveway in the neighborhood was lined with cars, and men shuffled into the clubhouse in clusters, their voices low and nervous. Rumors had spread quickly. Richard had promised a reckoning for me, a final blow that would remind everyone who really ran this community. He strutted into the room like a conquering general, his press shirt tucked neatly, his smile sharp with arrogance. His eyes darted to me as I entered, but I didn't flinch. I carried a thick binder under my arm, heavy with months of evidence, and laid it carefully on the table at the front. Richard slapped his gavel down. "Gentlemen, let's begin. Tonight, we'll discuss ongoing violations, chief among them, the case of our persistent river trespasser." He jabbed a finger at me, his voice dripping with mockery. "This man thinks he's above the rules, but the HOA always wins." The room chuckled uneasily. Some board members nodded, but their smiles were tight, forced. Others shifted in their seats, as if they already suspected something was about to change. I waited for Richard to finish his tirade, then rose slowly. My voice was calm, but carried across the room with deliberate weight. "Actually, Richard, I think tonight we should talk about your violations." He froze for half a second, then laughed too loudly. "My violations? Please. This man is desperate." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my binder and slid out the first document. A large, embossed deed with the county seal glinting under the fluorescent lights. I placed it on the table for all to see. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is the official deed to the river and surrounding access land. Purchased legally, signed, and recorded." Gasps rippled through the room. Men leaned forward in their chairs, squinting at the document. One of Richard's own board members whispered, "That's the county seal." Richard's smugness cracked. He snatched the paper up, scanning it desperately. This is fake. It has to be." But before he could rant further, I pulled out the second layer of my trap, a stack of letters. "And these," I said, laying them down one by one, "are your forged notices. signed with a county stamp you had no authority to use. Here's the original letterhead from the clerk's office, and here's yours, the forgery. Identical font, identical spacing, but not identical signatures. One of the neighbors stood up, pointing. I got one of those letters. You said I owed river access fees, or I'd be fined. You lied to me. Murmurs grew louder. Richard's face reddened. He slammed the deed back on the table and barked. Lies. He's twisting everything. He's the one who broke the rules. But I wasn't done. I slid out a thick sheriff's report, signed in blue ink. And here is the sheriff's official statement, confirming your fraudulent claims and recommending a criminal investigation. The room fell silent. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. I pressed further. Do you want me to play the recording, Richard? The one where you bragged about breaking me? Because I have it here. I held up my phone, thumb hovering over the screen. A hush blanketed the room. Richard's own allies looked down at the floor, unwilling to meet his eyes. His power was bleeding out of him, and he could feel it. No, he muttered, voice cracking. This isn't how it's supposed to go. I leaned closer, my tone sharp but measured. This is exactly how it goes when a man builds his power on lies. Richard tried one last time to recover, slamming his palm on the table. This meeting is adjourned. I am still president, and You're finished. One of his board members interrupted, his voice firm. The man turned to the crowd. He's guilty. We all see it. He's done. The final blow came not from me, but from the neighbors themselves. One by one, men stood and spoke. You fined me for my truck being too close to the curb. You lied about my fence height. You threatened to lean my house over trash cans. Each accusation piled higher until Richard's voice was drowned out completely. His reign had collapsed in a single night. I stood straight, gathering the last piece of my plan. With deliberate calm, I held up a final notice, my notice. Effective immediately, I declared, all HOA members are permanently banned from accessing my river. Fishing, swimming, boating, it's off limits. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, disbelief. Men turned on Richard, their anger no longer hidden. He slumped into his chair, pale and silent, staring at the table as if the wood grain might offer him a way out. Within weeks, the consequences landed. Richard was removed from his position as president. The county pressed charges for forgery and fraud. Restitution was ordered for the neighbors he had cheated, and his once unshakable reputation shattered overnight. As for me, I returned to the river. The signs bearing my name stood tall along the banks, gleaming under the sun. I cast my line into the current, the water mine to protect and enjoy. For the first time in months, peace returned to the neighborhood. Richard had thought he could find me for fishing, but he never imagined I'd by the river and ban him forever. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of property rights, neighborly conflict, and the strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a determined individual.